This week, Paul and I take a look at the latest Apache Struts2 vulnerability as a case study for why you should adopt DevOps practices. In the news, the popular video game Fortnite is having a bad time on Android. Oracle states that companies need to start paying for Java patches in 2019, and Node.js apparently has problems with cryptography. Stay tuned for all that and more on this episode of Application Security Weekly.
This is a Security Weekly production. Layered Insight is the industry's first embedded security approach for containers. Trusted by Global 1000 enterprises to secure their containerized applications, it's the only solution that requires no root privileges, has zero dependency on the underlying infrastructure, and is fully portable across any container environment. Unify DevOps and SecOps, enabling the rapid development of containerized applications without worrying about security. To learn more, please visit layeredinsight.com/ASW. Rapid7 powers the practice of SecOps. Using shared data, analytics, and automated workflows, SecOps unites IT, DevOps, and security teams to make security an outcome of innovation. Rapid7 combines technology, expertise, and advocacy to drive vulnerability management, application security, incident detection, and log management for more than 7,000 organizations worldwide. Power up your SecOps practice with a free trial at rapid7.com/securityweekly.
Welcome, everyone, to episode 30, our 31st episode of Application Security Weekly. I'm, of course, your host, Keith Hoodlet, and I'm excited to be joined once again by my illustrious co-host, Paul Asadoorian.
What's going on, Keith? How are you?
Dude, I'm good. It was a bit of a week last week. You know, the weekend was a little interesting as well, with some events happening related to this latest Apache Struts2 vulnerability. But yeah, otherwise I'm doing okay. How about you, Paul?
Hey, I'm doing good, man. I'm here hosting shows, so I can't complain.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. Speaking of hosted shows, by the way, we got a couple of quick announcements. So first, make sure you register for our webcast with Javelin Networks entitled How to Get Attackers to Contain Themselves, which will be airing on August 30th, which is this Thursday from 12 p.m. to 1 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Go to securityweekly.com/Javelin to sign up today. Paul, they've got a pretty good product. I know that you've been working with them for a while. Active Directory seems to be the bane of most people's existence, and seems like Javelin is doing a pretty good job helping customers out.
You know, I really like their solution and their approach to the problem with Active Directory security. I always have since I met them a couple of years ago at InfoSec World in Orlando. And they're just continuing to knock it out of the park. And their technical team is just outstanding. You know, a lot of former Israeli military folks in there that really know Active Directory very well and how it's exploited, and have developed a great solution for defense. So I'm excited about this webcast. And I mean, if you have Active Directory, you should be attending, which is most of you in the audience, right? I mean, if you're an enterprise,
just about everybody.
Yeah. There are some other directory services out there, certainly, but you know, obviously 90+% of the market share is with Microsoft's Active Directory.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Also, just another quick announcement. Thermo Fisher Scientific, my employer, is hiring. Specifically, I have 2 openings for application security engineering roles that I'm interviewing for starting this week. So go ahead and check that out on wiki.securityweekly.com. There is a link in the show notes for episode 30, episode 29, episode 28. Needless to say, I really want some applicants to go through and, you know, get a chance to chat with me and some of my colleagues about their career opportunities. So definitely apply for that. Lastly, DerbyCon is holding its first ever mental health and wellness workshop. And to help support their efforts, please go to derbycon.com/wellness to go ahead and either donate your time, or if you have extra cash in your pocket that you want to donate for their supplies, feel free to go ahead and do that as well. I'm actually speaking as part of the village, so that'll be kind of fun. Or the workshop, I should say. And Paul, you're speaking at DerbyCon as well, are you not?
I am. Giving my hip-hop
Awesome.
talk.
I look forward to that. I think they're coming out with the schedule in the next few days, so
yeah.
It'll be interesting to see if I have time to get over to that, because I want to sit and heckle in the front row again, I think. Absolutely. Is my plan. So with that, I wanted to kind of switch over to the kind of main segment here, which is Apache Struts2 RCE vulnerability. Pretty bad because, well, remote code execution is terrible, and Apache Struts2 is everywhere, or seemingly everywhere, and most notoriously known for the Equifax breach last year for a similar vulnerability that came out. So, needless to say, I think that the response this year was pretty good in terms of vendors getting out and patching or offering mitigations. But I wanted to use this time to talk a little bit about a few things that I think are important for businesses to learn from in terms of why they should adopt DevOps and
Hey, Keith,
kind of what things they need to have in place.
before you do that, can you just kind of put together in audio format, right, an architecture map of where Apache Struts sits in a typical Java environment?
Yes, I have got the best metaphor for this that I've been using for the past about, I don't know, 4 days or so at this point, which is this. So I like to use the analogy of baking a cake in this case. And the reason that I use that is because if you think of a recipe as your code that you're going to go ahead and put together and compile, in this case, Java, you're going to have ingredients. And some of those ingredients might be, I don't know, like a mixture of spices that kind of come prepackaged. Maybe you've got a coffee cake that you're making and you've got some cinnamon and you've got, some other spices that go into it. Well, those you might buy as a prepackaged set from the store. You put them all together with your eggs and your flour and all that other good stuff, your sugar, and then you go ahead and you bake that. And once it's fully baked, you then have your cake. And your cake is considered effectively your web application, right? So the hard part of this problem is this, right? Effectively, as a business, you first need to know where are you using that set of spices across your environment. How many people are baking cakes and which ones are using this in their recipe? And then secondly, because of the way that Java works on the endpoint system, and now it might be, or I should say endpoint server, it might be bundled up in a WAR or an EAR file whereby you kind of package all of the application up together and then you deploy it out to production. Well, once it gets deployed and the Java process is called, those files are kind of exploded out. So you'll have, struts-1-1.jar, or, maybe some are specific to the functionality, but you'll have struts files showing up on your file system as part of your web application that your Java application will make calls to for functionality purposes. So
Struts is a library and or framework? Is how I would describe it?
I would say it's a library.
Okay.
So the difference is a framework defines the way in which you do things. A library is something that you call for its functionality.
Okay.
Right. So in the way that the spice is used as a prepackaged thing that you throw into your recipe, you say, okay, I want these set of flavors, and they all come together as this set of spices, and I just throw them into the recipe. Well, in Apache Struts, when you're writing a Java application, I want this set of functionality that I can get from Apache Struts, so I'm just going to import that functionality from the Struts library. So once you have that situation in place, the problem when it comes to finding it is, first of all, scanning your file system on all of your servers is probably pretty slow because you got to figure out which ones are actually running as web servers in production. And from there, which ones have Java applications on them. So if you don't know that, you got to scan all of them. And for some companies, that's a lot of servers.
So wait, in the cake analogy, is your oven the web and application server?
Sure, why not? I mean, it could be.
Right.
I mean, it is effectively serving up the cake or delivering the baked.
Yeah. I guess your app server is like the oven that bakes it, and maybe the web server is the cookie sheet that you're putting your cake on to take it in out of the oven to serve it, right?
Sure. I mean, that works perfectly, right? Like you can just keep going with this analogy, and now I really want cake. But with that being said, I mean, it's hard to find unless you know who's using that bit of that library as part of their code,
because it's
that ingredient.
It's a library. I gotcha. And
right.
Are open source like scanning tools able to find this Struts library, given that it's a code library and that's their mission in life?
So initially, no, believe it or not, there was a POC that was out there, but there was no good way to scan for this. So eventually, last year, when the previous remote code execution vulnerability came out, Nmap built basically a script that I think runs probably curl or something similar to that. That allows you to scan for the 2017 version. But of course,
that's dynamic. That's dynamic testing. But what about
Yeah.
something like a White Source or Sneak or Black Duck? Like, are they able to go into your
Ah.
code repositories and find it?
Yes, in fact, that's actually one of the things that I wanted to bring up, which is
Okay.
this. If you have a centralized version control system,
Mm-hmm.
you're actually in a much better place than most companies because, again, and I think we opined on this on a couple of episodes. The whole point of having centralized version control is it allows you to scan the code base for libraries that might have
Mm-hmm.
vulnerabilities in them. This is the perfect use case for that
Right.
because, yeah, if you got Sneak or White Source or Source Clear or Black Duck or any of the
Sure. There's a bunch. Yeah.
companies that do this,
Mm-hmm.
then you can go ahead and actually find it right in your version control system right away, which is super helpful. Now,
Oh,
the other
sorry,
part of the
Keith.
problem,
The other thing that I want to make
yeah,
sure we cover too is this actual vulnerability and associated exploits. Like, how easy or difficult? Like, how do you pull it off?
well, as of this morning, there is an exploit kit that
Mm-hmm.
covers 3 out of the 4 Apache Struts RCE vulnerabilities that are out there dating back to 2012.
Okay.
So, in terms of ease of exploitation today, the 27th of August, 2018, it just got a lot easier.
I gotcha. Now, is there
Which is
certain conditions that have to be met? Do I have to implement it in a certain way or include certain aspects of the library or versions?
Yeah, so in this case, there was a configuration that needed to be set, which is actually set by default, depending on if you're using some of the plugins that go with Apache Struts.
Mm-hmm.
So the first is the always select full namespace flag is set to true in the Struts configuration, and that's actually set to true by default if you're using because of popular Struts convention plugins or the popular Struts convention plugin, I should say. The other side of it is if your application actions that are configured without specifying the namespace or have a wildcard namespace, you then have a problem as well. You're then vulnerable. So basically, if you are calling as one of those actions, and it has it in the write-up in the wiki itself, as something that it allows the namespace to be defined effectively by the user, more or less, you now have this remote code execution vulnerability because of the values that you can now throw into that field that gives you the action. So it's not necessarily exactly like this, but I like to think of this somewhat like the model view control problem where, if you have a /star action, it means take the action on any directory or any, view associated with this application. And that's effectively where the problem is the way that Apache Struts is interpreting that input and then working with that input could be malformed. And as a result, you get remote code execution because you can actually escape out of that process and now say, okay, Apache Struts do these other things or Java application do these other things on the system that it wasn't intended to do. So you'd have to build effectively Java commands that would get thrown into the Java application to run that.
Gotcha.
With that being said, because there was a POC and now there's an exploit kit out for these things, early into this, I mean, within the first 16 hours or so from the vulnerability being disclosed, there was a POC out and available.
Mm-hmm.
Within the first few hours after this broke, it didn't seem like there was a POC available. Most people are like, okay, we should work on this, but we don't have to think the sky is falling. And then within a day, there was already a POC out there. Within 4 days, there was an exploit kit. So this is the world we live in today, where any major vulnerabilities for frameworks or, well, in this case, libraries is going to get an exploit pretty quickly. So it means you have to be fast at actually developing and fixing these problems, which, apart from shared version control, which helps you detect it early, which is, a huge indicator that you actually need to go fix things to begin with. The next part is you have to have good test environments, which also is precluded by the fact that you have to have a good test suite, right?
Mm-hmm.
So you can't just replace this library in production. I can't just say, okay, take that file and replace it with this other file and we're good. Answer is no. Unfortunately, if you're back more than one version, right? So if you were on 2.3.34 or 2.5.16, which were the previous versions to the patch, you could update without any problems whatsoever because there was no backwards compatibility issues. It was just a security update. But that also means that you had to be on the latest version prior to the patch coming out last Wednesday. Mm-hmm. So how many companies are there is probably few and far between. And for most companies, it's probably like certain microservices in their architecture are up to date.
Yeah.
But everybody else isn't.
Is it difficult? I mean, we think of library updates as being fairly easy, to get updated, but is it the case of technical debt that you're so many versions behind in the library that the longer you let that update wait, the more debt you incur? In other words, the longer it's going to take me to fix because I have a lot more code to update. Is that basically what's happening here?
Yeah, so what happens is the library may have deprecated certain functionality that you were making use of in your older version that no longer exists or is actually responding in a different way in the newer version. The way I like to think of this is if you're a person that likes to cook and you go out and you buy a certain spice that you like and you buy it in bulk and then you run out, say, a couple of years later and they don't have it anymore, replacing that spice with something else as a supplement or a substitute may or may not be good, right? Like it might produce a different result when you go cooking, and therefore you might be like, well, now I got to go to Amazon and see if anyone's selling this old thing that I used to buy.
So we run into that with cigars, believe it or not, Keith. Actually, it's a perfect analogy because you may use, let's keep it simple, 3 different types of tobacco in your cigar, right? And maybe 2 of those you're growing on your own farms. However, you got the wrapper leaf from some other country, Ecuador, right here in the U.S. in Connecticut, or Cameroon, Africa, right? And all of a sudden that supply of that particular leaf runs out and they don't have that particular kind of leaf anymore. So, the reaction in the cigar industry is they either create a new brand and entirely different blend that's based on the old one, but they're like, hey, there's something new in here that I've changed, or they try and find something similar. Usually cigar aficionados are like, yeah, something's not right, like this blend has changed. And the cigar industry tries to avoid that, right? But if the supply is depleted, you got to make a decision, and that can force you to go through the whole blending process. In this case, right, it's going to force you to redevelop a whole bunch of code, which takes time.
Yeah, and the other thing is even if you do redevelop that code, so say for example, you're of the mind that, okay, we're just going to try and update the version and then work through the bug fixing. If you're enough versions behind, that time frame that you're going to use working through the bug fixing is going to be a really big problem if you do not have a good test-driven development suite of unit and integration tests to confirm that your functionality is working the way you need it to, right? The easiest thing that you could do is if you have a really good, test environment plus, suite of tests that you're going to run, is just update the version and then run all of your smoke tests and all of your other things and just push it into production, right? Now, if you're not up to date with, DevOps practices of fast flow and rapid feedback, which is, having a centralized version control so everybody knows what everybody's doing and being able to react to when tests fail, you're going to have a bad time, right? Because you can't just replace the library and expect it all to work the same way. Then from there, you got to figure out, okay, who's patching where or who needs to patch, right? So say, for example, Paul,
let's back up to your previous example. So let's say I'm updating a piece of code, right? And I call, inside of my own function, I call a function that doesn't exist, but further down, I've got like another loop or if statement, and inside there I'm calling yet a different function. Like when I change the first one, it changes behavior until I figure out I got to change the second one, and that's not compatible with my first change. Like you can run into a really gnarly dependency problem, which costs you more time in fixing this problem.
Yeah, and it means you're vulnerable for longer. And unfortunately, a lot of the times, in this case, thankfully, a lot of the vendors responded very quickly to pushing out either mitigations or some sort of protection mechanisms for companies to make use of. But even still, right, the fact that it took 16 hours for someone to come up with a POC, I guarantee you that there were probably people that did not publish their POCs and or their exploits until well after those that have already arrived, right?
For sure.
So at that point, it's almost just hope that you're either a target that is less noticeable and therefore, less likely to be attacked by the bear, or that you can outrun the bear by simply, maybe blocking your site for a couple hours and then trying to get things in place while somebody goes off and attacks like the large financials, for example. So from there, I guess the biggest problem though is, so now say you know where you're vulnerable and say you have good test suites to make sure that you can patch. There are likely going to be times, especially when you have third-party off-the-shelf software that is also probably running this vulnerable version of Struts, you got to figure out, all of those different places where you're going to be vulnerable inside of your environment at the end of the day. And one of the nice ways to actually track that, by the way, is shared ticketing systems. If you actually have the ability to know who's working on what their status is, you save time because you avoid, emergency meetings, like emergency status update meetings, for example, which I'm sure a lot of people were experiencing last week. And on top of that, then you don't have to worry about necessarily constantly sending out emails to update people, right? Like that's the second most ineffective way is first, getting everybody on a call is probably going to slow people down because it takes devs away from actually developing. And second, if you're sending out emails every 15 minutes or every few hours for an update, may not be useful, right? Again, it might pull people away from what they're doing to try and fix these problems. And so having a shared ticketing system that everyone can look at and say, where are we? Okay, like I can now look at this and say, why isn't that team starting? Or I see that team is stuck, but this other team solved a similar problem. So now we can get these two teams together and work on that same problem that was already fixed somewhere else, right? That's another benefit of having a shared ticketing system. Mm-hmm. I know, Paul, do you have any questions about that part? Because I also wanted to mention, like, getting the word out is also just as important as detecting it all.
Yep.
Which is getting to my next point.
Yeah.
ChatOps. So yeah, ChatOps. In this case, I know that we talked about this with Jessica Rosine. So for this specific instance, now you do want to have a system of record here to track, how things are going and how the word gets out ultimately. But if you need to message out to all of your IT operations and development teams, and you have a shared chat environment, whether that's Teams or Slack or something else, right? It's really easy for you to have like an announcements channel, or even like a rapid response channel, for example, that you can go ahead and say, hey, look, there's this major vulnerability. We've got this wiki that's set up with all of the details that you need that we're keeping regularly up to date. We're here and available for questions. We can start to identify the key players and start to identify teams that need to actually remediate and get everyone on the same page, right? One of the worst things that you can have happen in any enterprise environment when these sort of vulnerabilities go down is the chaos that ensues by not knowing who's leading, not knowing who's fixing things, and not knowing like what information each person has, right? You have to kind of keep it all centralized in some way.
Yeah, it's like some pages right out of the Phoenix project right there.
Yeah, right. It's like you don't have to call anyone in. You don't have to wake anybody up. Like everybody has access to it. And to that end, I mean, if you have to have maybe a leadership team meeting of some kind, like that might make sense, right? Get the C-suite or the VPs or like the senior directors together, because they should probably all be on the same page. But the actual devs and ops folks, and even some of the security folks that can provide insight, they actually probably should be on a shared, chat system of some kind, because it allows people to answer questions. It allows teams to identify, hey, we had the same problem and here's how we fixed it. So you get everybody patching that much faster, right? Because this is a drop everything, fix it kind of bug in my mind, which is huge. Any questions on that point?
If you can't do that, you gotta, as you say, buy some time.
Yes, and that's the most important thing in my mind is, okay, I don't know exactly where this is in all of my environments. I don't know which teams are patching and where. I don't know, who's running into problems and who has questions, or who has all the information and who still needs it. But if I have systems in place that allow me to buy time for my organization, I should implement them as fast as possible. So I know that we earlier were speaking about Akamai. So Akamai has their edge-based WAF that they have. Signal Sciences, again, another great product that is actually had a virtual patch that came out for this, which is our story number 1 under bugs, breaches, and more, within like 24 hours or so of the bug actually coming out. So in that case, it was like, okay, cool. They could virtually patch my vulnerable systems so that I could buy time for my development team. Because, Paul, as you and I probably have both experienced, you do not want developers to actually be developing when they're tired or under duress, right? You want them to stop and think about what they're doing. Otherwise, they're likely to create problems that you might not have tests for.
Well, yeah.
And by the way,
or just not. The worst case, I think, is the false negative, right? Where they change code, it looks fixed, but it's really some vulnerabilities are still there. Because like you said, there was 4 remote code execution vulnerabilities. So like, did you fix all 4 use cases? I also have that same concern with anything on the edge or perimeter of your network that is trying to block these attacks coming in. We talk about traditional WAF, the innovations in next generation WAF, and do they actually protect all of these different use cases? Coming from a vulnerability management background, that was a big difference. I would see when a big vulnerability is released, everyone's messaging, hey, we can block this. And when like you dig under the covers, you're like, well, yeah, you take care of like 2 out of the 4 use cases, but what about these other 2? And they're working on updates. So be careful of that when you see we have a virtual patch, which I hate that term. We have a virtual patch for this this set of vulnerabilities, and does it really, which use cases does it catch and which one is it missing, so you understand your risk.
And so just to clarify as well, the 4 RCEs that I'm talking about specifically is there was one in 2012, I think there were 2 in 2017, and then there's this one, right? So some of them are actually a little bit older, and hopefully by now those, companies that are actually protecting your enterprise have already worked on those, but who knows, right? Like the one in 2012 back then, who were the vendors in this space, right? There were very few people that were actually doing WAF in 2012 as effectively as they are today with, kind of the next gen WAF, much to Zane Lackey's chagrin when I refer to Signal Sciences that way.
I know.
But still, I think that for what Signal Sciences is proving out in the marketplace is if you are sitting right next to the application, or you're right next to your piece of cake in this case, the nice thing is rather than worrying about the requests that are coming in per se, like at the edge, right? Who's making the request? You can actually look at what is happening as a result of the request in the application itself.
Yes.
Which is, I think, where Signal Sciences does things really, really well. Because if they're saying, okay, how is the application reacting? What does the request look like? And what would be the result of that request going through to the application? Yeah, we don't want to let that run through. Go ahead and block that one. That's effectively what their virtual patching is in this case. And we'll talk about that more in the news segment. But in my mind, as a DevOps shop, the few things that you need to think about kind of as a recap here is first, get on centralized version control. And by the way, you can absolutely capitalize on this opportunity if it comes to talking about what you really need to be doing in your business. If you are now doing an after action or a post-mortem on this whole RCE and all the panic that came about as a result of it, one of the first things I would go and ask for is centralize your version control system. Because as a security team, guess what? You can now tell them where they're vulnerable everywhere, and you can actually get the right teams working on it without having to wake everybody up at 2 a.m. and starting to get a reaction time out there of, hey, fix all your stuff, who has what where.
And then there's a newer category emerging, Keith, that I'm starting to explore a bit based on some briefings we did at Black Hat. In particular, pay attention to the one that we did with Versec as they're trying to address this problem on the application side, but by using what we term as an endpoint agent, right? And in this case, the endpoint is not the end user workstation. The endpoint is your web server infrastructure or the machines that are running your application, and putting an agent on those systems to detect what may have gotten past your application, and in this case, remote code execution vulnerability, and detecting some of the exploit methods and payloads as you would on a traditional endpoint system on the end user workstation. So I thought that was an emerging kind of tech that can be looked at as a good stopgap measure that doesn't rely on some of the WAFs that may be regular expressions, or if I encode my payload in a certain way, it might get missed. The next generation WAFs have a much better chance, or RASP, right? Because they're in the application, as you stated, Keith. And then your final line of defense is sitting, underneath all of that, trying to figure out if something bad is happening.
It's almost like endpoint protection for the application, right? It's like applying your traditional antivirus to application behavior.
Yeah.
Which is, it's a novel idea, and I think that it definitely presents as an opportunity for businesses going forward to explore, maybe something else that will fit in that space. What will be hard, I think, for that market is it endpoint protection or is it WAF, right? Like they're eventually going to have to choose between the two. RASP kind of like walks that edge a little bit, but to the extent that it's kind of both, but it's not really both. I don't know how to define it other than it protects your application at runtime, which is important, right? Or at least it can be in this case, because it can allow for all of your users to be able to still use your site, but it also prevents people from actually, attacking your site effectively. Any thoughts or questions, Paul? I know that we kind of ran through all of my thoughts on this, but
I think we're good.
To be alive.
I think it's a good time to take a break and come back and talk about the news.
Sounds good.